G'day. Today we're going to look at extinction and biodiversity and a little bit about invasive species, but generally it's about biodiversity. Currently, we seem to be in a biodiversity crisis. We have lost a lot of species in recent years. And there's an article that was posted recently where we're looking at about 60% of known species have gone extinct since 1970. So in certain places, this is a really big deal. In coral reefs, we're looking at 70% of coral reef habitats that have been threatened or destroyed. We're looking at very few mammals realistically, but even so, it's over 5,000. Way more amphibians. We're looking at almost 2,000 that are critically endangered. And bird populations have really crashed in recent years. So this is a link to that article I was talking about that came out a couple years ago. And it did a large study on habitats that are in decline and species that are in decline. It's the largest study of its kind. And they found that 60% of global wildlife. So we're not talking plants and fungi, we're just talking animals. 60% of animals that we knew have been wiped out since 1970. So that's huge. It's worse in neotropical regions. So there's a large number of extinctions happening in Central America, Caribbean, a large number happening in Central Africa, in the Polynesia area. But even like things like freshwater ecosystems, that we have so many in Canada. And this study has shown that 83% decline of freshwater ecosystems worldwide. So just because we have a lot of freshwater ecosystems, it's threatened globally. Freshwater is a limited resource that humans are fighting over. So before we continue on talking about biodiversity generally, I want to talk about what it is. So we talk about biodiversity as how many species there are. And we can talk about the biodiversity of an ecosystem or of the earth or just one forest. But scientists also like to talk about genetic biodiversity. So a species that is on the brink of extinction, they still add to the general biodiversity, but within their population, they are not genetically diverse anymore. If there's only one group of that species left, then that greatly decreases the genetic diversity. For example, we can have subspecies of wolves, and they might all be Canis lupus, but then we have subspecies of them that lead to genetic diversity, even though technically it's all the same species. We see this in the salmon populations as well, where we'll have the same species of salmon, but the freshwater Great Lakes populations are going to have very different genetics than the Passamaquoddy Bay population, which is going to have different genetics than the Arctic population, even though they're all technically the same species. So we start losing that genetic diversity when we lose those subspecies. The other thing that this paper really points out is ecosystem diversity. We're starting to lose whole ecosystems. We're losing freshwater ecosystems. We're losing coral ecosystems. So this is part of our worldwide diversity that we're losing. Ecosystems that we've lost, we always talk about deforestation. That's always high on people's minds. Recently, the fires in the Amazon have really brought the Amazon to the forefront, but we, in that discussion, kind of forget that the African rainforest is in dire straits, that Madagascar's deforestation is sickening, that Haiti has almost no trees, that Borneo's deforestation is so far gone. It again is upsetting. We also talk frequently about coral reefs and how several times they've been in the media that the coral reefs are dying. And they haven't died yet, but they're pretty limited to what they used to be. And the ones that are there are not as diverse. And we don't notice it all at once because it happens slowly. This generation doesn't remember how diverse last generation's coral reefs were, doesn't remember how diverse the generation before's were. So we're trying to save what we remember a coral reef being like, which is still diminished from its original capacity. Lastly, I want to talk about mangroves, because as populations start growing in these tropical climates and our ocean levels start changing, mangrove forest loss has become a huge problem. So as of 1990, there were 35% loss in mangrove forests, and that number has skyrocketed in recent years. I couldn't find a number that was exact. Every paper seems to record it differently, but we're looking at drastic decreases in mangroves. And then I haven't even mentioned prairies. In the winter sister course to this one, ENSC 2007, I have a whole lesson just on prairies because we don't consider it an extinct ecosystem, but a lot of biologists do consider it a critically endangered, if not extinct, ecosystem. This was one of the largest ecosystems on the planet, one of the most productive soils on the planet, had huge herds. Think of the African savanna, but bigger. All of these large organisms were out on those prairies, and humans came in and we turned it all to farmland. So the red is the cropland that is farmland in North America, and the green is the original extent of the prairies. And if you look at where this overlap is, there really isn't very much space left for prairies. We have turned almost all of the original tallgrass prairies into farmland. There is some of the shortgrass and fescue prairies left, but not very much. Most of the prairies are farmland, and specifically the tallgrass prairies are a globally critically endangered habitat, and most of the species that used to live there are either critically endangered or extinct. Globally, ecosystems, whether they're endangered or not, are not evenly distributed. Some ecosystems are just naturally more diverse than others, so the loss of them is harder on global diversity than others. A great example of this is looking at Lake Victoria, which is in Africa, near south of the equator, like source of the Nile kind of area. And Lake Huron is, you guys know where Lake Huron is, but they're about the same size. They're about the same shape, they're about the same water depth. And Lake Victoria has over 500 species of cichlids. So we're not talking about all the fishes that are in Lake Victoria. There's too many, I don't want to even talk about them. Just the cichlids, there's 500, and they're all endemic. So they're only found in Lake Victoria. Whereas Lake Huron only has 79 species of fish total. That's all of the fishes. And none of them are endemic. They're all found in other lakes, other places around North America. So why is this? Why is one lake so biologically diverse and another isn't? And if we look globally, habitats near the equator tend to be more species diverse. And then we do have a few outliers here and there, but generally these warm places have more species diversity. And all of our hotspots, again, we have a few weird outliers. New Zealand is a good example. It's not tropical per se, but most of our hotspots are in tropical regions, tropical forests particularly, and tropical reefs. This is a question that biologists have been trying to answer for years, is why do we see so many species closer to the equator? Species diversity increases around the equator. There's a bunch of theories about this. Some say there's more energy, right? Because of the sun is more direct at the equator. So that means there's more energy for plants. So then there's more energy for animals. They also say, well, maybe those plants are growing faster, so speciation can happen faster. So the dividing of the evolution of one species into two. Another argument is a lot of these equatorial habitats are older. Because of the Ice Age, everything in Canada got wiped out. The glaciers covered them for thousands of years. And everything that lives here had to come back, had to move here post-Ice Age. The equatorial habitats still were running strong at that time. So they've had more time to evolve and speciate. A third argument is the stability. The seasons don't vary. It's the same year round. So you don't have to bulk up for winter and then either sleep all winter or do very little all winter. You can afford to become a specialist. Northern animals typically are generalists. They can eat a bunch of things, they can live a bunch of places. They need to be adaptable because there aren't a lot of resources available. In the equatorial regions, there's tons of resources and tons of competition, which leads to more specialization, which leads to more speciation, more diverse species, which means we have more endemic species in these warm places or more hotspots. This link down below is a great video by Smarter Every Day that talks about this exact thing. So I recommend watching it. He goes into more detail than I did about why those things work the way they do. This brings us back to the original article where we've lost so many species. And a lot of biologists are talking about being in a biodiversity crisis. How many species have we lost in the last, like, say, 1,000 years that humans have been around and recording? And when we start to add up the numbers, it looks like we're, in some estimates, 500 times higher extinction rates than what we've expected. It's huge. So what does that mean in terms of expected? How can we have an expected extinction rate? So when we look at the fossil record, we see a background extinction rate of 1 species per million per year. So if there are 10 million species alive right now, 10 of them might go extinct naturally on their own. That just happens through natural forces. And we call that a background extinction rate. So trying to estimate that based on the fossil record, based on the number of species today, is difficult because not all species become fossils, and we still haven't found all the fossils. So if you count and record all the extinct species that we know about, since about the 1500s when we've written record of these sorts of things, you have an extinction rate of maybe 30. So that's 30 times the background rate. Now, if you assume that we can't count all the species, some papers up that number to a background extinction rate of about 1,000, which is crazy. But some articles say, well, that's assuming that so many things, that it can't be 1,000, that you can't assume that all of these things went wrong. So they bring that number down to 500. So that's the conservative estimate, is 500. So if you just count species, we're at like 30. But then when they conservatively estimate that 30 to include species that we obviously didn't record or don't know about, they estimate it to be 500 conservatively, which is a huge, huge number of extinct species. And that brings us to the 6th extinction. This is a map in millions of years of the background extinction rate. So that's what that green line is sort of the background extinction rate. And these little peaks are mass extinctions. So occurrences in our fossil record where extinctions are greater than the background extinction rate. And you can see that some of them were huge. And they're so huge that before humans even believed in mass extinctions, geologists recognized that in the rocks you can see these layers. And they named these eras of history of the Earth based on this change in the rock, not knowing that that change in the rock also was a change in extinction rates. So we call these End-Ordovician because we have the Ordovician era epoch based on those rock formations. And it just so happens at the end of one, when we switch to the Devonian, there's a mass extinction there. There's a reason why the rocks changed. A lot of things happened on the Earth. The End Cretaceous, which we call the KT extinction, that's the one with the dinosaurs. So the Ordovician was a really big one. The Permian was so huge, we call it the Great Dying. So look at that, 84% of marine genera and 70% of land species. That's crazy. And this is a question I asked my first years, and I'm going to ask you guys again. We look at these fossil extinctions, we look at these mass extinctions, and we wonder why we're worried now. Maybe extinction is just something that's going to happen. The Earth is still going. Because of the KT extinction, that allowed mammals and birds to rule the planet. We wouldn't be here possibly if that KT extinction didn't happen. So why are we so worried now about the extinctions that are happening? Why do we care about biodiversity loss? This is another paper, and you can see that species decline, and this is during humans, like human activity, 1500, that's when we start like recording these sorts of things. And since about the Industrial Revolution, we see a peak in species decline. As human population starts to grow exponentially, decline of other species starts to grow exponentially, well beyond the trend that we were seeing up until that point. So there's kind of like a tipping point where we feel humans' impact has become too great. A great example of this is bird counts. We've been doing bird counts for 100 years. And this is the American tree sparrow. This is a super common bird. You have seen an American tree sparrow, probably in your backyard at some point. They're not as common as house sparrows, but house sparrows are invasive from Europe. American tree sparrows are the most common native North American sparrow. And you can see from the yearly point counts that humans in California took of the American tree sparrow, that there is a definite trend of the population declining. That every year, and there are good years and bad years, you can see peaks and troughs all along, but generally, the population of American tree sparrow, one of the most common birds in North America, has declined drastically over the 100 years of that bird count. Now, trying to explain why we're seeing these extinctions, why we talk about humans being in a 6th mass extinction right now, we are trying to look back at our past mass extinctions and figure out why they happened and help correlate to what's happening now. But sadly, those happened so long ago, we don't really know what caused previous mass extinctions. But by looking at rock layers and correlating those to fossils, looking at the nutrients that are in the rocks, the chemicals, we've sort of come up with some hypotheses. So the Permian extinction, that's the one I was saying that we call the Great Dying, that was the biggest mass extinction in our history. They think this was volcanic activity that caused extreme global warming. So this is looking at carbon records in fossils. And that is their current theory, that global warming caused the Permian extinction. So if we look at the 5 past extinctions, what possibly caused them? The first one, they're thinking maybe an ice age. The second one, they're thinking there was a drastic drop in oxygen levels. Well, they know there was a drop in oxygen levels. They don't know why or if that was the cause. In the Permian, they definitely see some volcanic activity and increased levels of certain chemicals in the atmosphere, which leads them to think it was global warming. They think the Triassic might have also been global warming, but they're not sure. We're pretty confident that the KT, the Cretaceous and Cretaceous extinction, was caused by an asteroid impact because of the iridium layer and the crater that they found with iridium. That leads us to our 6th extinction. What is causing it? What can we do to help it? Can we learn from our past mistakes? When you start talking about the 6th extinction, if it's happening or not, if the extinctions that we've seen are enough to call it a mass extinction, we start talking about the Pleistocene extinction. So this is the megafauna, like mammoths, that are now extinct. And as a child, you probably grouped these large extinct critters with the dinosaurs. But they didn't live where the dinosaurs lived. They lived with humans. This is a recent extinction. So this only happened like a few thousand years ago. In the grand scheme of the history of the Earth, 10,000 years ago is not that long ago. 50,000 years ago is not that long ago. There's arguments on whether it was caused by human or climate, and we're just not sure, but there's some good evidence that some correlations that when we see evidence of humans in Australia, we also see evidence of megafauna going extinct. When we see evidence of humans traveling to North America, we also see evidence of megafauna going extinct. So it's a really interesting dynamic where we don't know for sure, but it's kind of a crazy coincidence that when humans arrived in these places, the large megafauna disappeared. Was it because of overhunting and overharvesting? Was it because humans brought diseases with them? Was it because humans destroyed the habitat? We don't actually know what exactly caused these different extinctions. But currently, we're looking at climate change being a big part of that because there's so much evidence showing that the Permian extinction was greatly affected by climate change. And even the KT extinction, which was an asteroid, that caused a massive climate change as well, which is what eventually ended up causing those species to go extinct. This always brings up an argument about invasive species and how damaging they are, because invasive species outcompete local species. They bring diseases with them. They can destroy habitat. But are they actually causing extinctions? In some cases, it's really obvious. In terms of flightless birds that never saw predators before, there are huge extinction rates. When we bring invasive predators to islands, the bird species decline drastically. Flightless birds on islands almost always go extinct after we bring in predators. But flighted birds also have problems because they nest on the ground. So if you bring in animals that eat eggs, like rats and pigs and different kinds of weasels, those birds that nested on the ground that were safe from predators, even though they can fly away, they can't reproduce because their eggs keep getting eaten. So it's not just flightless birds. Bird species generally are greatly affected by invasive species in these island habitats, the dodo being the classic one, elephant bird in Madagascar, and the moa in New Zealand. This is a kakapo, which is another New Zealand parrot that's critically endangered. There are so many species of bird in Hawaii that I can't even begin to talk about how many of them have gone extinct. It's huge, like 3/4 of the bird populations. Another great example of invasive species affecting global populations are the chytrid fungus. So this is the fungus that is causing the amphibian population to decline. They think the chytrid fungus originated from importing an African frog where they get a pregnancy test chemical from. They're not 100% sure, but they think that's the source of it. But it's been devastating to the amphibians of Central and Northern South America. It's been a problem elsewhere, but not like it has been in that one spot, like just crazy extinction rates in that one little area. Way less of a problem, even though we have frogs here. The chytrid fungus just hasn't been as big a deal in everywhere except in that one spot. And you can see the dark red of Central America and the northern part of South America. This is a meta-analysis where they looked at a lot of other research papers and tried to figure out the cause of decline of species. And what I love about this is it sort of breaks it into categories. So the biggest ones are habitat destruction from humans. So this is just us taking up more space than we need, whether that's our houses, our roads, water dams, all the things, direct human habitat destruction. That's most of the species. After that, they have invasive plants. So they're not talking about invasive animals at this point. This is just invasive plants. And you can see predators and herbivores is way less, but it is a problem. But worse than invasive predators and animals that we're bringing in and bringing into places are domestic animals. Grazing and the introduction of domestic grazing animals is one of the biggest causes of species decline. Local examples of how invasive species affect extinctions is really interesting because we can look at zebra mussels. So zebra mussels, if you've ever swum in the Great Lakes, are a horrible blight upon the Great Lakes. They just cover all the surfaces. They're filter feeders, so they really clear up the water, but then they also clear out the nutrients that other critters need to survive. And they're so difficult to get rid of because they just grow everywhere and their larvae are so small. They'll grow on top of other animals. So if you have natural mussels growing in that lake, the zebra mussels will grow on top of those natural mussels. They'll grow in your pipes. They are horrible. but they haven't actually caused any direct extinctions yet. Oh wait, I have a picture of mussels growing on mussels and mussels growing on crayfish. Crayfish move. Like, that's how bad zebra mussels are. Like, growing on a mussel, it's like growing on a rock, but growing on a crayfish, they move a lot. Anyway, despite this crazy takeover of zebra mussels in the Great Lakes, they haven't actually directly caused an extinction. They've caused some species declines of other bivalves, other mussels, but scientists have been doing studies to think like maybe those species were already in decline due to human pollution and activities like that, and the mussels are just better adapted to dealing with humans. So it's an interesting, when we talk about invasive species causing extinction, this is causing havoc on the ecosystem, but is it actually causing extinction? Another great example of this is purple loosestrife. This was like considered to be one of the worst invasive plant species. It was super high profile because it was moving north into Canada, and people are like, ah! But it hasn't been linked to any extinctions, despite the fact that it just takes over wherever it spreads to. It hasn't caused any actual extinctions because it only grows in areas that were already disturbed by humans anyway. So we already caused the displacement or extinction of species already before the purple loosestrife got there. So then we were spending a lot of resources on trying to control the purple loosestrife population, and then several papers came out showing that it wasn't actually hurting any local populations more than we were already. So like, do we want to spend resources on controlling these invasive species or not? How dangerous are they? So it's things like this that make it really difficult for biologists to fight arguments against a sixth extinction. Because for every example of an invasive species that caused an extinction, you have an example like loosestrife, where it's highly invasive but doesn't cause any extinctions. And it makes it difficult for scientists to argue that we're in a global extinction. This is a huge problem that we need to deal with, when people can cherry pick data and pull out examples that aren't alarming. So it makes it difficult to prove that this is a sixth mass extinction. And then there's the argument about biodiversity. Just because purple loosestrife hasn't caused any extinctions doesn't mean that it is a good thing for the local biodiversity, whether that biodiversity is counting the number of species or the amount of genetic diversity. Globally, the more space that's taken up by purple loosestrife, the less space there is for other species. So there's always that argument. Anyway, that's enough food for thought for today, I think. Have a good day.